Good morning, Jack.
Morning, Bob.
Let's talk this morning about the situation in Los Angeles. There are National Guardsmen and women on the ground there, pursuant to the president's invocation of constitutional and statutory authority to deploy them there to address unrest in response to ICE activity there to locate and then set up for deportation illegal immigrants. So, the first question, and I think the focus for our conversation today is let's talk about the legal basis, the constitutional and legal basis on which the president has acted. So let's start with that.
Sure. So the first thing to start with, I think, is the Posse Comitatus statute, a late 19th century statute, which kind of sets the baseline here. And that statute says that the military cannot be used for domestic law enforcement unless it is authorized by the Constitution or a statute. So that means that the president, if he wants to use the military in the domestic sphere, he has to either find an authorization in the Constitution or the statute, or he has to use the military pursuant to, in a way that's not law enforcement. What the president did was, in a memorandum, was invoked 10 U.S. Code 12406, which authorizes him in certain circumstances to federalize the National Guard. This is the way I read the memorandum, in certain contexts, including in cases of rebellion. And then, as I read the order, and here I'm following Chris Mirasola, his analysis on lawfare, which I agree with, the president is exercising his Article 2 power after federalizing the troops to the so-called protective power to protect federal property and federal functions that the president said are being jeopardized by the riots in Los Angeles. That's the basic legal basis.
And can you talk a little bit about the source of the claim of constitutional authority to exercise that protective function? Where does that come from?
It comes from a long string of Justice Department legal opinions going back to the 19th century that says that the president has inherent power under Article 2. It's not really specified in the opinions what part of Article 2. It's kind of the commander-in-chief clause in the executive power to protect the functions and the federal government and the property of the federal government. The typical cases that are cited are In re Nagel. That's the main case. It's a late 19th century case that said that the president had the authority to protect a Supreme Court justice from threat. And that opinion had lots of language in it that talked about these broad presidential powers to basically protect. And that case and another case called In re Debs have been relied on in a series of OLC and DOJ opinions to flesh out this Article 2 power. And to emphasize, it's not a power to enforce the law. It's a power to protect federal property and to protect federal functions. So that's an important distinction.
So let me follow up by asking this question. You stressed the protective function here. Is the line a blurry one potentially between the protective function and more direct assistance that the troops could give to federal law enforcement?
I suppose it could be a blurry line at some point. I mean, the line in theory seems pretty clear that the immigration authorities are the ones that are supposed to be enforcing immigration law, conducting these enforcement actions in homes and workplaces. And what the protective power would permit the president to do is clearly to protect the federal buildings from attack and to protect the officers enforcing the law from attack, to allow them to do their jobs. Now you can imagine, that getting blurry when if they're going along with ICE on ICE raids to protect them from in those functions. You can imagine those functions blurring, but the line in theory, I do think is clear.
Can you talk a little bit about why you think he took this step and didn't go, if you will, the whole hog to the Insurrection Act?
Yes, I don't know why. I mean, I think it's important here to understand while this is a very serious act by the president in terms of federalizing the National Guard for these purposes, it is, in my judgment, a much smaller step than if he had used the Insurrection Act itself. He could have easily and lawfully invoked the Insurrection Act, even at this early stage, I believe, to quell violence and to ensure that federal law could be enforced. As you and I have written about in the past, we've worked on this issue. The Insurrection Act is a very broadly worded set of authorizations to the president to use the military for various forms of domestic law enforcement. The president could have done that, and he didn't do that. Why he didn't take that much more aggressive step, I obviously don't know. I mean, this you could say that there wasn't a problem with law enforcement. There was a problem with protecting law enforcement, and that's what he wanted to do. Perhaps the president wanted to send a signal that he was taking this seriously and was prepared to do more. Perhaps he thought this was what was needed to protect the ICE function in Los Angeles. I don't know, but this wasn't the most extreme step, that's for sure.
Although a critic could also say, could that critic not, that he stayed away from the most, sort of controversial at this point, well-known exercise of this kind of authority, but fundamentally he was still sending 2,000 National Guard troops to Los Angeles, doing it, for example, without consultation with the governor of the state. And so he landed, at least for immediate purposes, in the same place.
I don't think he landed in the same place. I mean, he sent 2,000 troops to Los Angeles for a very different purpose than would have been the purpose had he invoked the Insurrection Act. So I actually don't think it's in the same place either legally or in practice. These troops will be protecting federal functions and property and not enforcing immigration laws. I do think
That,
that's an important distinction.
no, it's an important distinction. I guess a critic would say, first of all, we'll see. But secondly, as we discussed earlier, as this develops, there is again the question of whether or not in practice, specifically in practice, these troops are going to be engaged in more than just simply, protecting buildings from protesters defacing, walls and so forth. I mean, there is, when I say in the same place, he has troops on the ground there, and there is, once they are there, a question of how they're going to be deployed. Or is that overstating the
Well, I
potential
mean,
here?
he could this morning invoke the Insurrection Act and use them for a different purpose. But we'll have to see. We'll have to see what happens. Whether this is going to remain a relatively small step, we'll have to see what happens in Los Angeles. It seems like the violence is growing worse overnight, and there's tons of presidential discretion here and about whether and how to invoke these authorities. And there are pretty powerful norms in against using the military in the domestic sphere for law enforcement. And that would be politically a much more controversial step by the president if he did that. And we'll see if he's going to do that. Maybe he's signaling that, but he has not done that yet.
Let's talk for a second also about the role of the state here. The president and the governor had a conversation apparently, but the governor did not request federal military or National Guard assistance. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, the view expressed at the time was that state and local authorities could manage this on their own. Talk about the significance of the fact that this is not an instance in which the federal government was called upon, nor was there anything in the situation that immediately suggested that federal military assistance was required.
Well, I'm not sure I would agree with the very last part, but
Okay.
I think that I don't know the answer to whether any federal military assistance was required. It's just very hard for me to tell how threatening the situation was, how bad it was, how likely it was to get out of control in terms of protecting federal property and functions. Um, but there was a conversation Friday night between the governor and the president. We know that Newsom did not want and thought that there was no need, in support of your point, for any federalized National Guard assistance. We know that because he said so many times. We don't know what their conversation was, but we do know that the next day the president issued this order. So he wasn't persuaded by what Newsom said. Usually in these circumstances, the governor and the president work together. Um, that happened in Katrina, and I think there was a bit of a standoff there. It certainly happened in the Rodney King riots in the 1990s, where I think there was a request made by the state for the federal help. So, in a normal presidency in normal times, the federal and state governments would be working together as a matter of practice, yes. I mean, that's just not what's happening here, and it's not required by the law.
So let's talk to the implications of presidents having this kind of authority. You and I have worked on Insurrection Act issues together, and there are just a series of uh, weaknesses, absence of constraints, however you want to characterize them, in the construction of the authorities that presidents can call on. Uh, One example would be, so I would like you to comment on all of them. One example would be length of deployments. The president has determined, if I understand or recall the order correctly, that the National Guard is being deployed for a period of 60 days. Uh, there are no limits on presidential deployment, nor any accountability to the Congress or to the states for decisions like the length of deployment. So, can you talk about that in the context of what some people have thought is urgently needed reform of these authorities?
Sure. I mean, these authorities are very broadly worded. I mean, we're just talking right now about this narrower protective power, which is still a robust power, and not going all the way with the Insurrection Act, which is basically using the military in the domestic sphere for broadly conceived law enforcement purposes if the criteria for the statute are triggered, and that's the president's call mainly. Um, but there are no reporting requirements to Congress. There are no time limitations on this. These very broadly worded statutes go back actually to the 18th century, to the first decade of the nation. And, we've got reporting requirements and we've got ostensibly a 60-day limit on the use of war powers abroad in the War Powers Resolution. There's nothing like that on any of these statutes. And given the main constraint on the use of these statutes in the past, since they're so broadly worded, has been this powerful norm and this powerful political concern about presidents using the military in the domestic sphere. And presidents have hesitated because of these politics. And DOD has basically does not like domestic law enforcement deployments. It's contrary to their mission. They're not well trained on it. They don't like turning inwards to use their force on U.S. citizens. This is a longstanding general view of the Department of Defense, and those norms and practices have been what's constrained the statute. And the concern here is, of course, that President Trump has not had a history of being bound by norms and political constraints. Now, he may be bound by this here. It remains to be seen whether it would be good for him politically, even in this immigration context, which they seem to think is playing so favorably for them. It remains to be seen how it would work for the president if, in the face of larger scale riots, he did bring the military into the domestic sphere using the Insurrection Act. That remains to be seen. But the main check on the statute has been politics and norms and not law. These are broadly worded authorities without limitation and without congressional consultation or a congressional role, really.
And Congress, for example, in the war powers context, has of course complained a great deal about, and people have various reasons why Congress has complained but not done anything about it, about the president's failure to consult meaningfully with Congress and make
Even,
unilateral decisions. Pardon me?
even though there's a consultation requirement in the War Powers
Even though
Resolution.
there's a constitutional requirement in the War Powers Resolution itself, why has Congress, is there any theory you have, any thought you have about why Congress in this context has been prepared to kind of hand the keys over to the president and not worry about it?
That's a hard question to answer. Again, this statute really hasn't been amended in a very long time. I mean, there was an amendment to it, and then they killed the amendment after Katrina. But the basic substance of the statute goes back, I think, over 100 years. And it developed at a time in which well, that's not really true. There were built into the 1790 statute, there were some procedural requirements. A court act had to actually approve the use of this of an early Insurrection Act authority in one context. I don't know. I mean, there have been calls for reform of the Insurrection Act going back to, in my knowledge, the 1960s. They probably were earlier in light of some of the worries growing out of the riots in the 1960s and early 70s about the open-endedness of these authorities. I mean, we worked hard on Insurrection Act reform for the last 4, 5, 6 years, and it obviously got caught up in current politics, and there was just no chance of that happening, even though other elements of reform emergency powers reform collateral to the Insurrection Act, got very, very far and had bipartisan support in the Congress. I can't speak to why, to the explanation for why Congress hasn't tightened up this statute, but it is the Insurrection Act and these National Guard authorities generally are extremely broadly worded.
I would posit, and tell me if you think this is not a good working theory. I would posit that part of the reason that Congress hasn't, if you will, been particularly aroused to do anything about it is precisely because there has been some expectation that presidents would show some deference to the concerns of states or to the requests of states or the absence of those requests and to the exercise of that power under constraining norms. And in the absence of both, maybe there would be some movement toward reform because you can't rely on those expectations any longer.
We'll see. I mean, we're actually going to find out, I think. We're going to find out. I think, if there turn out to be very serious riots, if the protests and the violence grows, if the president ends up using the Insurrection Act, if the military get involved in law enforcement in Los Angeles, a lot will depend on how that goes. And whether this works well for the president or not politically. I mean, it's very, very hard to predict. I do think, I mean, this might be naive, and it wouldn't be the first time I've been accused of being naive, but this was a small as opposed to a large step under National Guard authorities. And it could have been, and it was again designed basically as a more or less defensive or protective function. They could have started right out of the box with something larger. So, what I'm trying to say is it could be that politics still have a constraining role here. All of these questions, I'm afraid we're going to find out over the next weeks and months.
And we'll return to it. I'll say on my part, as you know, I don't know whether you call it a more cynical view. On the flip side, I see the administration has deciding not to engage with Insurrection Act because the history is so fraught. The immediate history is so fraught. But having taken a step here that lays the foundation for a serious problems ahead in the consideration and exercise of these kinds of authorities. But as you say, we're going to see. We're going to see whether that turns out to be the case or not. And you and I are certainly going to be talking and writing about it.
Great. That sounds like a good place to stop.
Great. Thanks. Have a good day.
Thank you, you too.